and welcome to Washington Talk. I'm Eun-Jung Cho. North Korea continues with its missile provocations, with one flying over the de facto inter-Korean maritime border. North Korea also launched an intercontinental ballistic missile that failed, prompting the U.S. and South Korea to extend air drills. The Secretary of Defense met with his South Korean counterpart and reaffirmed the U.S. commitment to provide extended deterrence. Before we turn to our panel discussion today, first we have an interview with former Secretary of Defense Mark Esper.
Primarily to make clear to the DPRK that should it go forward with a seventh nuclear test, there would be additional costs and consequences.
And we'll continue to work closely together to develop options to protect the United States and our allies in the region.
Secretary Esper, welcome to Washington Talk.
Thank you. It's great to be with you.
Secretary Esper, North Korea has test-fired a record number of missiles this year, and it also test-fired an ICBM recently. Is the level of escalation and tension comparable to 2017, the fire and fury period?
It does seem comparable in terms of the amount of missiles being launched and, of course, all the events that followed. And so it compels us to look closely at what's happening and try to understand what is going on in Pyongyang.
Right. Secretary, in the U.S.-ROK Security Consultative Meeting Joint Communique, Secretary Lloyd Austin noted any North Korean nuclear attack against the U.S. or its allies or its partners is unacceptable and will result in the end of the Kim regime. It is the first time such wording is included in the SCM document. It was also in the recent nuclear posture review. Are there discussions of ending the Kim regime within the DoD? Is this only being resurfaced now?
Well, I think what Secretary Austin is speaking is a matter of fact. It was a view I share as well, that the use of nuclear weapons by the North Korea would result in a response by the United States and the Republic of Korea that would likely end its regime. So I think it's stating a fact. I think it's very fair and proper to be very clear with Pyongyang about the stakes and to continue to try and deter their bad behavior.
It is a fact, but we are trying to get North Korea to the negotiating table. We are reaching out to North Korea that we want unconditional, no preconditions to bring North Korea back to the table. But we're us talking about ending the North Korean regime. How does that go on with the U.S. efforts, diplomatic efforts to North Korea?
Well, the statement said that the purpose wasn't to end the regime. What the statement I said as I read it was that if North Korea attacked the South or any of the United States or its allies using nuclear weapons, then that would result in their end of the regime. Look, I still think the intentions of Seoul and Washington are spot on with regard to trying to resolve the long-standing issues between the North and the South and the United Nations, if you will, and denuclearize the peninsula. We have never threatened Pyongyang, and we've only responded to their actions. And I might add that I think the responses taken the last several days have been the right ones. We should match them action for action and make sure that we show clear resolve and resoluteness with regard to the ironclad commitment between our countries. And by the way, I do think, though, that we should be doing more to include Japan with regard to our responses and our messaging.
At the SCM, U.S. and ROK pledged to further strengthen the extended deterrence capabilities. How is it different from before? I mean, U.S. provided nuclear umbrella to South Korea from 1978. Are we saying that there were some holes in that umbrella before?
I don't believe so. I think the commitment for both conventional forces and extended deterrence has always been ironclad. I reinforced that in my many, many meetings in both Seoul and Washington with my counterpart at the SCMs and so on. Look, I think if there are ways to continue to reassure the people of South Korea, I think we should look for ways to do that. I think some of the things they outlined make sense to me in terms of increasing consultations and transparency, but I don't think it suggests that there was a weakening in that commitment.
Mm-hmm. That increase in consultation, is that anything new? Do you see anything new coming in terms of extended deterrence provided to South Korea?
Well, I'd want to dig into what exactly they're referring to and how they plan on doing it before commenting in more detail. But again, I think generally, if we can enhance consultations and improve transparency between our two governments, our two militaries, that's always a good thing. And I personally would support looking at those things.
Do you support providing South Korea with U.S. tactical weapons on South Korean soil?
Well, I don't think it's an issue that should be taken off the table. As you know, the United States for many years, up until the early 1990s, had tactical nuclear weapons deployed in South Korea, always under U.S. control. That's not something that I would take off the table ever. Although it's not something I think needs to be injected into the discussions right now either.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. What about South Korea's own nuclear development? Are you for the idea?
Well, we should never deny any country the right to make sovereign decisions about their own defense. I would say again that I think Seoul can count on Washington's commitment to extended deterrence. I think if we move to a point that we think that those discussions about U.S. provision of or stationing of tactical nuclear weapons, to me, those are the first types of discussions. But what you have to think through is not just the deployment of U.S. Weapons on the peninsula. And I know, a large majority of South Koreans support, the deployment or the use or deployment of or production of their own nuclear weapons. But I think you have to think beyond just North Korea, because there's that factor. But you have to think about how the other players in the region might react, to include China and others. So those all have to be part of the security discussion, because I've argued consistently that North Korea is clearly the most immediate danger to South Korea and challenges our alliance. But we have to look beyond North Korea. We have to look at China, which is just next door as well. And clearly, there is growing belligerence coming out of Beijing, aggressiveness with its neighbors. We've seen that in past several years with South Korea and what they did with cutting off trade and tourism for a period of time. So I think we have to look strategically as well about how we change and adapt our force posture on the peninsula and in the region.
Now, Secretary Esper, last time we spoke, you told me that President Trump was determined to withdraw U.S. forces from South Korea and that President Trump would continue to push that if he had a second term. What about extended deterrence? Is that something President Trump or any other president could consider withdrawing from South Korea unless South Korea increases its burden sharing?
Well, those issues are, presidential level decisions. I think I never had those conversations with President Trump, but look, it's obviously the decision by the United States on what to do. But my sense is that is a long-standing commitment by the United States to our ally South Korea. It will endure from administration to administration, and it's critical to maintaining peace and security in Northeast Asia. So I don't see that changing anytime soon.
Secretary Esper, we're concerned about any first strike coming from North Korea. Does the U.S. and ROK alliance have capabilities to overwhelm North Korean aggression immediately?
Absolutely, both in the nuclear realm and the conventional space. The combined armies and militaries of the United States and South Korea are dominant in all aspects of warfare. So I'm completely convinced that we can not only defend the South, but if need be, we can take the war to the north and be victorious.
Now, when you visited Taiwan in July, you said Taiwan should stock up on asymmetric defense capabilities and war supplies, including energy and food. Would you advise South Korea likewise, especially with the increased risk of localized clashes?
Well, it's a very different situation. Taiwan is facing a much, much larger neighbor with vastly superior and larger amounts of weaponry. So Taiwan is unable to beat China in a head-to-head conflict. That's not the case with South Korea and North Korea. South Korea has a much more capable military than the North Korea. That's not even counting the United States. So I think at a head-to-head contest, South Korea and the United States have more than enough capability. That said, I will continue to argue that South Korea needs to do more, spend more on its own defense, and that it needs to invest in the right capabilities. And those are outlined between the United States and South Korea, what those are. Those are critical to the operational handover control handover, OPCON transfer. We know what those are, but I think the South Korea needs to accelerate those investments and build the strongest deterrence capable possible in the shortest amount of time. Look, we have no idea what's going to happen in the next few years with regard to Northeast Asia, particularly if China decides that it wants to bring mainland Taiwan back into the fold, bring Taiwan back into the fold of the mainland by the use of force. We don't know how that'll affect the peninsula. So I think it's important that we be in the strongest position possible heading into the next several years.
In the case of Chinese aggression on Taiwan, is there a possibility that U.S. forces in South Korea can be deployed to Taiwan? Do you think South Korean forces will be deployed to Taiwan?
Well, I think it's certainly possible that United States forces could be deployed to Taiwan or to assist in a Taiwan fight. Whether South Korea does or does not would be, a decision for Seoul to make. My sense is they would be defending the homeland, continuing to show a stiff resistance and defensive opposition to North Korea. But certainly there would be a support role as well, I would imagine, coming off the Korean peninsula to support any type of Taiwan scenario.
Secretary Esper, thank you very much for your time and insights today.
Thank you.
And now our panel today, Mr. Dennis Wilder, professor at Georgetown University. Mr. Wilder was Senior Director for East Asian Affairs at the National Security Council during the George W. Bush administration. Mr. Wilder was also CIA's Deputy Assistant Director for East Asia and the Pacific. Also with us today, Mr. Frederick Fleitz, Vice Chair of the Center for American Security at the America First Policy Institute. Mr. Fleitz was the National Security Council Chief of Staff during the Trump administration. Mr. Fleitz was also a CIA intelligence analyst covering WMD proliferation. Welcome to the program.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Now, as Secretary Esper just noted, tensions are high on the Korean peninsula, and North Korea is saying its missile testings are just rehearsal for using its tactical nuclear weapons. Do you think North Korea is thinking of its nuclear weapons as a practical war tool, not just a deterrent, Professor Wilder?
I think we have to be concerned about that. I think, though, what is happening right now is a broader issue. And by that, I mean that the American-led order around the world is under challenge. It's under challenge in the Ukraine from the Russians. It's under challenge in the Taiwan Strait from the Chinese. And I think the adventurism that we're seeing from the North Korean leader at this moment is taking a moment of opportunity to, again, want the world to believe that there is nothing but having a nuclear North Korea. And I think we can't give in to this kind of bullying and provocative actions.
Now, Mr. Fleitz, at the Security Consultative Meeting and also at the Nuclear Posture Review, U.S. was very clear that if North Korea uses nuclear weapons against the U.S., against its allies, against its partners, it means the end of the Kim regime. Does this mean that there are some discussions of ending the North Korean regime within the U.S. government? It is only being surfaced now?
No, I don't think so. I would agree with my colleague that there is a provocative element here by North Korea, but I think this is something we see periodically by North Korea to attract attention to itself before significant dates on the U.S. calendar. And I think the more than 25 missile launches we saw this week are directly related to the U.S. midterm election. North Korea would like to see negotiations started that it can use to extract concessions. It's done this over and over again. Mm-hmm. But concerning Biden administration on North Korea policy, I frankly don't know what it is. There's a part-time special envoy. When President Moon came to the White House last year, President Biden didn't want to say much about North Korea. The policy has been lacking because the U.S. focus has been on Ukraine, it's been on Iran, it's been on China, it's been on climate change. I think the North Koreans believe that they are not a priority for this administration. I think that is accurate. And I believe in light of these provocations, it's crucial that the administration start high-level talks with North Korea and implement a serious policy to prevent these provocations.
But, Mr. Fleitz, there are thoughts that Biden administration's North Korea policy is not that much different from Trump administration North Korea policy.
I couldn't agree more. Mr. Biden strongly criticized President Trump's personal diplomacy with Kim Jong-un. As said, he's named a part-time envoy who is also envoy to South Korea. There's been no effort by the Secretary of State to have direct negotiations with North Korea. We remember Mike Pompeo was regularly meeting with the North Koreans. And the reason is that the Biden administration has other priorities and wanted to engage North Korea multilaterally with our allies in the region. Maybe that was a gamble worth trying, but it clearly didn't work.
Mr. Fleitz, Ambassador Sung Kim said, over the past 2 years, the U.S. has privately and publicly offered to talk with North Korea without any conditions, but it is North Korea that is not coming to the table. What
Yes,
can the U.S. do?
at a lower level. It's true that Sung Kim, who I think was a fabulous appointment, he's worked in North Korea through Democratic and Republican administrations, one of the most brilliant men on the North Korea issue in the U.S. government. However, I think the North Koreans are looking for a certain level of attention. They appreciate the presidential level of attention. They appreciate the Secretary of State level of attention. I think that's a factor here.
Now, Professor Wilder, North Korea is shooting ballistic missile over the northern limit line for the first time since the Korean War. How serious is this? And South Korea responded with air-to-surface guided missile. So are we now at a point where the Inter-Korean Comprehensive Military Agreement is now nullified? And are we at a point where we could see more localized clashes between the two Koreas?
I think we're at a very dangerous point, and I think that we can't rule out the fact that the North Koreans, who have in the past sunk a South Korean frigate, done other such things, created incidents along the DMZ, I think that we have to be prepared. I would agree with my colleague that the Biden administration needs to take this even more seriously than it has so far. There hasn't been a major speech on North Korea by a leading official in the administration. I don't think they've seriously raised this issue with the Chinese. I would hope that when President Biden meets with President Xi in Bali, that he sternly talks to him about this issue and the provocations of the North Koreans. After all, I don't think the Chinese want the North Koreans starting another war on the peninsula. So I think that a lot of work needs to be done. We need to send very strong signals. I was glad to see the signals sent yesterday at the meetings about the fact that it is unacceptable for the North Koreans to even think about using nuclear weapons. But I think the administration can do more.
But all the while Trump-Kim summit was underway, North Korea developed its weapons, and now it's testing it while they were only developing it during that summit period. And what gains did we get out of those summits?
Well, I think that we have to continue negotiations with the North Koreans in some way, shape, or form. But I think unless you have the Chinese in the game with us, as we did in the six-party talks, it is very difficult to move the North Koreans forward. I think the North Koreans need to know that things could change on the Chinese border. Right now, 90% of what goes into North Korea in terms of aid comes from China. We need to get the Chinese to see that a destabilized Northeast Asia, where South Korea considers having nuclear weapons, when Japan considers having nuclear weapons, this is not in the Chinese interest. So they're not doing us any favors by pressuring the North. They're doing themselves a favor.
Now, Mr. Wilder, North Korean aggression against the South Korean maritime border similar to Chinese aggression against Taiwan. President Yoon Suk-yeol said if China attacks Taiwan, North Korea would likely engage in a provocative action. Do you also envision North Korea and China some kind of creating synergy and strategizing together to go against their respective adversaries?
I think we need to keep that from happening. I think that this is why engagement of the Chinese leader by the president is so important, because we don't want them to think that they can get away with such a thing. And it would be unthinkable to have two wars in East Asia at the same time.
I want to move on to South Korean desire to get nuclear weapons. Are you for the idea of U.S. redeploying tactical nuclear weapons to South Korea? Any one of you?
I think that temporary redeployment of B-1B bombers to South Korea should be on the table as a consideration if Kim continues what he is doing these days. If he moves ahead with nuclear testing, if he actually goes to deployment of tactical nuclear weapons, I think we need to have a response. I'm not in favor of providing the South Koreans with the capability to build their own nuclear weapons, because I think that will just lead to nuclearization of the entire East Asian sphere. The Japanese will want to move ahead. Perhaps the Taiwans will want to move ahead. So I think it's better to think about American redeployment if necessary, and also nuclear planning together with the South Korean government, something we haven't done at a senior level. And I think that is something that could be very useful.
Professor Wilder, exactly. Secretary Esper said, think of Chinese reaction if South Korea develops its own nuclear weapons. On the flip side, wouldn't South Korean nuclear development, indigenous development, might work as a leverage against our joint efforts against China?
Well, I think that what President Biden ought to say to President Xi is we may be forced to move in the direction of nuclear weapons into South Korea, into helping the South Koreans. Do you really want this? Is this the future that you want for yourself in Northeast Asia? So I think that it's very important to raise these topics, and to raise these topics with the Chinese in a way that says, your national security is now at risk, and do you really want that to happen?
Now, Mr. Fleitz, the White House recently said that North Korea supplied artillery shells to Russia. Is North Korea becoming a more important player in the U.S.-Russia rivalry and competition?
It is a major complication in the North Korea situation. It's also happening with Iran, that Russia's in trouble, so it's turning to two of the world's most notorious rogue states to help its brutal and illegal invasion of Ukraine. That's going to make it more complicated to negotiate some kind of an agreement with North Korea, if an agreement is possible, to stop the missile tests, to prevent it from testing nuclear weapons. Look, Russia's a great ally for North Korea. It doesn't care about North Korea's human rights record. It doesn't care if North Korea is developing long-range missiles. I don't think the Russians or the Chinese want North Korea to develop nuclear weapons. I think the Chinese really don't want that. They don't want more nuclear tests that could possibly leak radiation that would drift over China. But it is a huge concern, and it sort of represents North Korea going in the wrong direction in terms of bringing into the community of nations, which was the purpose of the Trump administration's negotiations in 2018.
Now, before we go, Mr. Fleitz, you are a professional staff member of the House Intelligence Committee, and we're just days before the midterm elections, and North Korea has traditionally been a bipartisan issue. But should there be a change in the congressional landscape, do you think that would somehow impact the administration's North Korea policy?
I think there's going to be a Republican House, maybe a Republican Senate, and there's a huge interest by Republicans in Congress, but also by Democrats for a more aggressive and serious U.S. policy in North Korea. I don't fault the Biden administration for putting its focus on Ukraine. This is a disaster that's taken a lot of resources and time. But when you run a foreign policy, you have to be able to juggle a lot of balls in the air. And I think there will be hearings and a lot of pressure on this administration to put forward a more serious policy in North Korea.
Thank you very much, and we'll continue our discussion next time. Mr. Fleitz, Professor Wilder, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having us.
That's all for us today. Have a great week, and we'll see you back here next week with U.S. experts to discuss the two Koreas and the region right here from Washington.